Kennedy says this, which may sound sort of a bit banal, but felt revolutionary to Lasker at the time. He said, advertising is salesmanship in print. And what he meant by salesmanship obviously had certain aspects of that sales formula. You get attention, you get interest, you get desire, you get action, which is actually, if you think about it, what Kennedy was doing at that moment. He then went on to explain, he said, imagine if somebody went into a shop and the shopkeeper just said, buy my products because they're good. That would be pointless. You have to give them a reason why. So these two ideas come into our ways of thinking about advertising very early on, that advertising is basically like selling, and it follows the same principles, and that one of those principles is that you have to give a reason why. Now, Lasker ended up hiring Kennedy, but he didn't last very long. He was an odd man and he left. And he was replaced by a much more famous copywriter, this man, Claude Hopkins. Now, Claude Hopkins wrote a book in 1922 called Scientific Advertising, which is probably the most reprinted book that's ever been written about advertising. Supposedly it sold 8 million copies. David Ogilvy was a huge fan. And Hopkins continued this idea of saying that advertising is basically selling. He says somewhere in the book, the only purpose of advertising is to make sales. It is not to keep your name before the people, not to aid your other salesmen. Treat it as a salesman, force it to justify itself. What did he mean by that? He meant that ads should hail a few people only, that they should not be frivolous or entertaining, that they should talk about the product, that they should give facts and information, that they should use lots of copy to do that, and that they should ideally then have a coupon which would invite a direct response. And his principles of copywriting were very much based on that. Now, he wasn't just making this up, he did actually have some evidence for how you write this kind of ad, because they were able to measure the responses to those coupons. They had split-run testing, A/B testing, right back then. It didn't just come along with the internet. So he knew what worked best in this kind of advertising. And actually, even today, I suspect these are still pretty good rules for direct response advertising. Most direct response advertising does actually keep it simple. It talks about the product, it gives facts, it gives information, it doesn't make jokes, it doesn't behave eccentrically. But the big assumption that Hopkins was making, which is not a very clear assumption to be making, is that all other ads work the same way. And I think that's much more questionable. So what about other ads? Because even before Hopkins was around, there were plenty of ads that looked like this, and there have been to the present day. This is an ad by the famous Lever Brothers company, who popularized Sunlight soap, one of the first consumer packaged goods brands in the latter years of the 19th century. And you can see this has got no product claims, no headlines, indeed no copy at all. We've just got a picture of a cute little girl with some cute puppies, and if you think cute little girls and cute puppies were an invention of the internet, then that's not true either. So there are obviously different things going on here. Now that creates an opportunity. I'm rushing through the story here, but you'll see where it's getting to in a moment. A little bit later, in the 1930s, this man, Daniel Starch, an academic professor who's written a book about advertising, invented a particular kind of research. And he said, okay, if your ad doesn't have a coupon, how are you going to measure its success? Well, he went back to AIDA and he said, okay, one thing we can measure is, did your ad get attention or not? So he had a research method that involved taking people through magazines, asking them, which ads did you notice, which ads did you pay attention to, and giving them a score. And that became hugely popular very, very quickly. It was very cheap and easy to do. It became known as the Starch rating, and it dominated print advertising in America and elsewhere from the 30s right through the 50s and well into the 60s, and I think a form of it certainly exists until very recently, if not today. Now, you'll notice that something interesting has happened here. We're still using the word attention, but the kind of ad that will get a high Starch rating is an ad that will attract everybody's attention. not just, as Hopkins said, the people who might be interested in buying your product. And that will lead you to do all the things that Hopkins told you not to do, to use funny pictures, to use white space, to use something that's eye-catching and eccentric. And a lot of the old school mail order copywriters like John Caples were very, very critical of the starch rating. One of them said in 1955, it's easy to beat that game, he said. Instead of showing a big picture of the car, you show a big picture of Marilyn Monroe and a little picture of the car. And if that doesn't work, you take some clothes off her. So you can see here that we've got two completely different ideas about what makes a good ad. Is it the one that tells you all the facts about the product, or is it the one that grabs your attention by showing a woman with no clothes on or whatever else is going to do that trick? Well, another academic came along a little bit later. This guy's George Gallup, and I guess he probably looked at Daniel Starch, saw he was making a lot of money and said, I can take a share of that market. So he invented a slightly different method. He said, it's not enough just to measure whether you've got attention. What's really important is, do people remember it? Because after they've seen the ad, they've got to remember what they've seen until they get into the shop and make the purchase. So he invented a measure of recall. And instead of asking people, did you look at this ad, did you look at this ad, he showed them the magazine and said, which ads do you remember seeing? And so Gallup invented this idea of ad recall, which, as we probably all know, is still one of the most commonly used ways of researching advertising and judging advertising. It's the basis, absolutely, of everything that a company like Millward Brown does, even today. And yet, it's still based on another big assumption that isn't really scientifically based, that an ad will only work if you can consciously remember it. But again, it was very simple and it was very popular. Then a little bit later, we get into the television age from the 1950 onwards. And then another very influential ad man, Rosser Reeves, who you've probably heard of, who ran the Ted Bates agency in the States, who was a big fan of Claude Hopkins and the idea of the hard sell, but felt he had to reinvent Hopkins' ideas for the television age. And Rosser Reeves's big idea was, what television ads have to do is they have to lodge in the mind a unique selling proposition. Unique, not in the sense that it's something that other people couldn't say, but just that other people don't say. And so he invented the USP, and he also said it has to be a single-minded proposition because people will only remember one thing from an advertisement. And that seems to be something that is still universally believed today, not least amongst creative departments. Although, as far as I know, there's no real evidence for it being true. And it's actually the opposite of what Claude Hopkins generally used to say, which is, the more you tell, the more you sell. So I'm running through a lot of ideas here. They take several chapters in the book, but I want to sort of pull them together at this stage and say, out of that idea of salesmanship, we get a whole lot of ideas which still dominate a lot of the way that we talk about and evaluate and process advertising. There's a kind of a family tree, and some of them go in very different directions. So first of all, you've got obviously the mail order principles, like give information, give facts, give a reason why, and those are still pretty good for direct response. Then you've got the big idea of attention, which, as we've seen in the hands of Starch, became something completely different from what Hopkins was talking about, and again dominates a lot of our discussion today. Is this going to stand out? Does it have cut through? Does it have impact? All these words that sound really important, although, to be honest, we don't really know what they mean. And then we get Gallup's idea of recall. An ad can only work if we remember it. And so that gives rise to another stream of how can we make our ads memorable, and then we get the idea of the message or the proposition from Rosser Reeves. You know, will people remember the message? Not just whether did they see the ad, but do they remember what this ad was trying to say? And the idea of the single-minded proposition, which still seems to dominate creative briefs and creative briefing today, even though it's very questionable whether there's much evidence for it. So all of these are what I call part of the salesmanship model of advertising, and it's still in many ways the dominant model. But what I argue is it's not entirely wrong, but it's certainly not entirely right either. And as you can see, it's internally quite inconsistent anyway. So what are the alternatives? Well, it ain't necessarily so. Let's go on to this chart. This is a quote from a book that was published originally in 1903, so about the same time that Kennedy was walking into Laska's office. And it's a book by an academic professor. And he says this: one young lady asserted that she had never looked at any of the cards in the street cars in which she had been riding for years. When questioned further, it appeared that she knew by heart every advertisement appearing on the line, and the goods advertised won her highest esteem. She was not aware of the fact that she had been studying the advertisements and flatly resented the suggestion that she had been influenced by them. Well, okay, this is only anecdotal, but still it is a black swan when we thought that all swans were white, in that it's showing us some evidence that advertising seems to be effective without having attracted any conscious attention at all, and certainly without being remembered. So both of those big assumptions are being questioned. Now, the guy who was raising these questions is Walter Dill Scott, who published a book called The Psychology of Advertising. And it's very early days, obviously, so he has lots of different ideas about the psychology of advertising. But one of the main ideas in his book is what he often calls suggestion, or also calls association, and I think that's a word that we probably use more often today. The idea that by seeing an advertisement, you make subconscious connections, but that doesn't mean you necessarily have to consciously process the ad, or you have to consciously remember it. Indeed, Scott talks at one point about how he prefers using ivory soap, and he can't really say why, except that it seems to him to have an aura of purity that other soap doesn't have. Now, it's interesting that that word was also used earlier by William Lever, the founder of Sunlight Soap, who talked about, and he said, the main thing that advertising has to do is to create an aura around the product. So we're talking in a very different language now, a very different model of how advertising might work from this fact-driven persuasion that we've been looking at earlier. Now, all of this comes and goes in the history of advertising. It comes very much to the fore in the 1950s, when we had a huge rise in what was at the time known as motivation research, driven by people like Ernest Dichter, who had come over, Freudian professors who came over from Europe around the time of the Second World War and introduced to Americans the idea that the unconscious might have a lot to do with how we make decisions and why we buy things. And this was very, very popular for a while. It was connected with the idea of brand image, and even linked with David Ogilvy, who in other ways was very much a Claude Hopkins man as well. And a lot of books were written about this. Very quickly, though, it became very disreputable because of this book, The Hidden Persuaders, which was published in 1957. And this was written as an attack on manipulation through the subconscious. Vance Packard made it all sound very sinister and dangerous, and suddenly the advertising profession got very, very nervous and said, actually no, we don't do that at all. All advertising is consciously processed. We are just honest salesmen giving the facts, and we don't do any of this subconscious stuff. So it became very, very difficult to acknowledge that there might be unconscious processing of advertising going on. Except that today, it's very difficult to pretend that that's so, because in the last 20 to 30 years, we have learned so much more about the way the mind works and the way the brain works. And people have applied these ideas also to advertising. And the idea that a lot of advertising does work through some kind of unconscious processing, like low attention processing, is now, I think, scientifically extremely well founded in books like this one. Can't really read it. Seducing the Subconscious by Robert Heath, for example. Many other references in the book. So it seems that this is not just a whimsical idea. This, if anything, is a lot more scientifically based, probably, than the salesmanship model, in that it's talking about how do we make decisions, how do we learn, and a lot of that is going to be inevitably subconscious. And maybe the word associations is important too. So we got to a point where we have a sort of big debate going on, and I think we see aspects of this debate. Is advertising about salesmanship, or is it about what I've called seduction? Well, again, maybe we can say both of those ideas are making it far too complicated. Perhaps it's a great deal simpler than that. You'll remember that one of the things Hopkins said advertising didn't do was this idea of keeping your name before the people, which was something that one of his rivals actually claimed advertising did, so that was probably why he said it. But you can see that there's a very long history of basically advertising saying, just put the name out there as much as possible and people will remember it. Now, it was easy for Hopkins to say, well, of course, that was very primitive and we're now much more sophisticated than that, and a lot of people believed him. Until quite recently, when Byron Sharp in 2012 published his very important book, How Brands Grow, which I hope you've all had a look at. But the chapter on advertising in that makes the very radical claim that all advertising really does is creates greater mental availability for the brand. It is, in Sharp's words, mere publicity. In other words, it has very little to do with whether it's either creating subconscious associations and emotions or whether it's giving you facts about the product. It's simply making you more likely to think of that brand in that choice situation. And if you're more likely to think of it, you're more likely to choose it because of the availability heuristic that Daniel Kahneman and other people have talked about. So we have a very strong argument here, and a very evidence-based argument that says maybe at the end of the day, all we really need to worry about in producing successful advertising is creating simple fame, or to use another word for it, salience, making something top of mind. So there's three ideas so far: salesmanship, seduction, and simple fame. And I think there are potentially three more. To keep it simple, there may be more than six. But now, I said when I worked at Bose Massimi Pollitt, we did work that was, I think, genuinely popular as well as being successful. Now, why did we think that was important? I think it was because when we all joined the agency, my first boss, Martin Bose, lovely man who is still alive, used to say to each of us something like this. He'd say, in a very English sort of way, he would say, we believe if you're going to invite yourself into someone's living room, then you have a duty not to shout at them, or to bore them, or to insult their intelligence. On the other hand, if you're a charming guest and you entertain them or amuse them or tell them something interesting, then they may like you a bit better, and then they may be more inclined to buy your brand. Well, at the time he was saying things like this, I thought, well, that sounds very nice, but it's not what I'm taught, when I read books about advertising. So I just thought, well, this is Martin being Martin. But then many years later, I came across the work of another man, Paul Václavic, who has nothing to do with advertising at all, but wrote books about human communication. And Paul Václavic makes some very important points, which I think can be applied to advertising. So communication is not just about the transmission of content, of a message from one person to another. What interested Václavic about communication is, why does communication take place at all? And what are the consequences of it? Why do we do it? So, for example, he was a psychotherapist, basically, so he would see that if two people were, if a married couple were always arguing, it didn't really matter what they were arguing about. It wasn't about the content, it was about the relationship. It's about who's the boss in this house, or something like that. So he suggests, amongst other things, that all communication has two aspects. It has an aspect of the content, and it has an aspect of the relationship. Now, I think this is a very interesting thought to apply to advertising, because if we think about what our advertising is doing, we tend to focus very much on the content, what is in this ad. But actually, what we could be thinking about, and might actually be the really important thing to think about, is what kind of a relationship are we creating between us, the brand, and our consumer, or the audience here. And to be honest, you know, if people who had started using the internet for advertising had asked themselves that question, then I think they might have not made a lot of the horrible mistakes that they have made, because basically, if your idea of advertising is simply to interrupt people and annoy them, what kind of a relationship are you going to create? I think that's the question that's worth asking. The fifth idea that I'd like to sort of bring into this is to compare advertising to public relations, which also has a long history. And in many ways, public relations, I think, has sometimes been a lot more sophisticated than advertising in its understanding of how people's psychology works. A lot of public relations has to do with this one man who had a very, very long life, Edward Bernays. And he pretty much invented the skill of it. Let me give you an example of the sort of thing that Bernays did back in the 1920s. He was given a brief by a tobacco company, how can we get more women to smoke? Because in those days, it was totally socially unacceptable for women to smoke. So Bernays said, okay, I'll do this. And he hired some elegant young women to walk down Fifth Avenue in New York on the day of the Easter parade. And then they all took out their cigarettes and lit them up together. And of course, this created a sensation. It made news. Photographers took pictures, and people asked them, what are you doing? And the young ladies had been briefed to say, we are lighting our torches of freedom. And so at a stroke, apart from creating news, which is a good part of PR, Bernays had also reframed the idea of women smoking from being, this is a disgusting thing to do, to this is a blow for equality, this is a blow for women's liberation. And it was one step in changing the whole attitude of making it acceptable for women to smoke. So, and you know, that's not necessarily a good thing, but it shows the power of what PR can do. Now, this idea of reframing or changing the way we socially construct the world, that is equally something that I think advertising can do and often does do. So I think if there's more to it than just what Byron Sharp says, this may be also part of it. So advertising can change the Volkswagen Beetle from being a small, ugly car to being the sensible, practical, rather hip car, and so on. But lastly, this idea sort of kept coming to me as I was working on this book, and I thought maybe I should go even further back in time. How many of you have seen the film called The Greatest Showman that stars Hugh Jackman? Oh good, a few people have. I don't know if it was a big hit in Spain. I mean, Barnum, born in 1810, by the way, so we're going back a long time, died in the 1880s. Hugely famous, probably literally the most famous man in the world during his lifetime, and invented so many of the principles of mass publicity on a global scale that we now sort of take for granted. So he's a very important historical figure, and I think there's a lot to be learnt from him. And the film is an entertaining film. It's very historically inaccurate, but what disappointed me about it is that actually Barnum's real life story is much more interesting than anything that happens in the film. It's much more incredible. So if you get a chance to read more about Barnum, he's much more interesting than what you see in that film. But Barnum, and one of the things that does happen in the film, although I don't think it happened quite like this, but they do make a point of, a critic calls Barnum a humbug, which was a very rude word at the time. It was saying, you're a fraud, you're a cheat, you're a, you know, whatever. And Barnum, in the film, takes that and proudly wears it. And he says, I am the prince of humbugs. And so he actually, and in real life, he did take this word very early on in his career, and he said, I am the king of humbugs, or the prince of humbugs. And he wrote a book about what humbug was. I mean, the sort of thing that Barnum did was, this is one of his early stunts. It's called the Fiji Mermaid. And as you can see, it's a rather uncredible sort of picture of a mermaid. He's stuck together a bit of a dead fish and a bit of a dead monkey. But in a way, that's part of its success, because people will pay to come and see it. And he hyped this enormously and got it written up in all the newspapers and toured it around the country. And everywhere people would pay money to come and see. And then they'd argue about, is it real or is it not? And so it became a huge sensation. And that was what he did. He liked to stimulate controversy, and whatever happened he could turn into more news, and that's how he made things famous. So this, which he didn't even invent, became hugely famous. He then applied the same treatment to something much more upmarket with the great soprano Jenny Lind. He did loads of other things. He ended up creating an enormous circus. He bought Jumbo the elephant from London Zoo. He did lots and lots of things. But this is what he has to say about humbug. And where I kind of end up in this book is saying all of these things have some truth in them, but the one that we perhaps least often talk about, we say, is advertising an art? Or is advertising a science? And yes, I mean, I can see it has a lot in common with art, and it has a lot of potential science in it as well. And yet, what we never say is, actually, maybe advertising is more like showmanship or show business. A lot of it, so much of it, when you actually stop and look at what's actually there and what actually works, so much of it is about, using the language and the means of popular entertainment and making things famous and getting talked about. It's using the tricks of Barnum, whether we like that idea or not. So that's why I got to the idea of humbug, and I said, let's just have a look at what Barnum says about humbug in his own book. He says, first, you attract the public by din and tinsel, by brilliant skyrockets and Bengola lights. I don't know what they are, but you can imagine there's a picture. Then give them as much as possible for their money. So it doesn't matter what you do to get the audience into the tent, but once you give them a good show, they're not going to complain. So an honest man who thus arrests public attention will be called a humbug, but he is not a swindler or an imposter. So that's why I borrowed the word humbug as part of the title for my book, because I'm continuing to think that this idea of humbug has a lot to teach us, and although we may try to avoid it. Now, as I was finishing the book, do you recognise this picture? How many people recognise this? Yeah, you're all in advertising, so I hoped you would. I don't know if anybody else ever saw it, but everybody in advertising saw it. It was about 3 years ago, and it was an ad that supposedly was viral. And yes, it's a nice ad for Volvo trucks with Jose Van Damme doing the splits between them. And this sort of came in as I was finishing my last chapter, and I kept being distracted by looking at Facebook and seeing all my friends were posting this. So I thought, well, using the different models I've talked about, which of them best describes this? And actually, I think they all do in a way. The question is, which one do you find most helpful or most useful? So, is it a salesmanship ad? Well, you could say it is. It's a demonstration. So actually it's very factual. It's saying, look how good the steering is. You wouldn't dare do this with other trucks. It's actually making a claim about the product, and it's demonstrating it. Or is it about subconscious associations, what I've called seduction? So we see this handsome, strong hunk of a man, and by association we think, Volvo trucks, handsome, strong hunks of trucks. Or maybe it's literally just because everybody's paying attention to this ad and saying, have you seen this ad? It's making us all think a bit more about Volvo trucks. Well, it certainly did me, because I'd never thought about Volvo trucks before. So maybe it's just salience, and so on. And yet, I think perhaps the one that for me sort of seemed to resonate most. Pause there and see if you'd like to continue the conversation. Thank you.